All right, I'm going to get into it. Let me pray and we'll start. Father, we thank you for time and your word. We thank you for just building up and enhancing our reading and our memory and our ability to recall and take in what we read. Help us, just bless the time, Lord, through your Holy Spirit and his understanding. Amen. All right, so we're kind of wrapping up. I'm going to wrap up the flood and move on pretty quickly. You can always ask questions, but the main thing I would draw out in the reading is that we were talking a little bit about it, the demonic influence of the pre-flood culture. Philosophically, I think that mankind had aligned themselves with demonic influence and demonic thought. That was kind of the main driver when it talks about the sons of God and cohabitating with women and sexual perversion, all of that's entailed, right? And that God was going to wipe that slate clean, right? And mankind, every thought and intent of their heart was sinful continually. And so Noah finds favor, and I think in verse 18, Genesis 6:18, the main point comes out there. God says, I will establish my covenant with you in this ark, right? You shall enter the ark. Here's the first ark of the covenant. This is the one. So it's the ark is the covenant. He says, you get in that ark, my covenant, I'm bringing you back out, right? God's covenant. God's going to do it. And so he does. They get in, right? The doors burst open, and God is the one who shuts the door. God closes the door behind him in chapter 7, verse 16. God is the one that preserves the ark, right? Was it a sturdy ark and a well-constructed, yeah. Is it going to survive the waters? Yeah. But I think the ark was such a destructive force. The flood was such a destructive force, nothing would have survived unless God preserved it, okay? Can it float for 40 days? Yeah. But was it going to survive the crazy weather and destructive force that took place during the flood? No way. Nothing would, unless God preserved it. And I think that's the whole point of drawing out that it was God's covenant with him that preserved them. It was God who closed the doors. It was God who told him to open the doors, right? It's time. So God preserves the ark supernaturally above all else. And again, you can go into, I could spend weeks and hours, talking about all, if you're in engineering in any form, shape, or form, the most destructive power on the earth is hydrostatic power. It's water power. Engineers are always looking to construct buildings to avoid water damage, right? It erodes beneath the foundations. It can destroy anything we build. Nothing can withstand a flood if it really gets let loose, and they're always worried about that. It just happens, yeah. So I'm recording, yes. And so that's the flood. Come on, move. There we go. It says, chapter 10, I'm kind of bouncing into the nations now. We're going into the category of the nations. The nations are the record, as it says in 1032. These are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies by their nations. And out of these nations were separated on the earth after the flood. So, like in Acts chapter 17, when God says he's the one who established the nations and their boundaries, where they were going to exist, it begins with Noah and his sons spreading out across the earth. And all of the nations of the earth are established through Noah, right? So, the easiest answer about racism, about anything else, is that we're all descended from Noah. We all come out of this thing 4,000 years ago from the same ancestry. And so all the nations of the earth come from Noah. There are no races on the earth. We're all descended from the same people. So the Bible speaks very clearly about that. And it talks about in chapter 11, we're going to try to do this quickly. Just stop if you have questions, but I'm going to try to go quickly on this one. It says the whole earth had the same language in chapter 11. So from Noah, we look at how the earth quickly begins to populate and spread out. And the command of God was that they should spread out across the whole earth, be fruitful and multiply. God designed the earth to exist with different national groups. Not ethnic groups, national boundaries. One nation should safeguard against another nation. The design of nations is a design by God to police the earth so that one nation would not be evil against the other nations. The other nations could stop them, right? We've seen that take place in our world wars. Adolf Hitler rises up and says, we're going to create a one world thing, the Aryan nation, whatever, right? The other nations have to come against him to stop that. That's God's design. That's God's purpose in establishing the nations, is that they would stop evil from spreading out across the earth. And that the purpose of Babel was that, no, we're going to create one nation, we're going to create a great name for ourselves, and we're going to have the centralized power across the whole earth so that we can do whatever it is we want, and nobody can stop us. And that's exactly what God says. When he looks at it in chapter 11, verse 6, he says, behold, they are one people and all have the same language. And now, whatever they purpose to do will not be impossible for them. Why? There's no other nation to stop them. There's not a policing system of nations that can safeguard against the evil spreading out across the earth, because they're all one. God never designed it that way. He said, go out, be fruitful, spread out and multiply. And again, from Noah, he wanted it so that they were all separated out of these nations would come, right, and design that way. Now, national governments are God's design. Romans 12 or 13 says God designed the nations. God designed government. God designed that it would be this way, that they would have the authority to police. And so even from the New Testament, we know that's true. This is the origin of it. This is God's design of the beginning of nations. And so this is what Babel was fighting against. The whole thing was they wanted a one world government so that nothing that they would do would be impossible. There would be no one to stop them. When you get to Revelation and God backs away from keeping national boundaries, the earth immediately goes into a one world government again. Okay? If God doesn't police and God doesn't restrict, mankind in his sinfulness and his evil is going to go right back to what they were doing in the beginning. And that's the outline of Revelation. That's what they do.
And that's what God's judgment will come in when they start doing that. He's not going to let them do that, in other words.
Yeah, he's got to back away and let them do that.
Oh, I mean, what I mean is they won't be successful. I mean, they won't...
Well, they will to a point, right? One nation, they're going to become a one world government, and they're going to get up and fight against them. They're just going to lose. Yeah. But yeah, they're going to actually be successful at creating Babel, if you will, right? What God stopped here in the beginning, he's going to let them do at the end.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll be successful in that there will be a one world government at that time. It will exist. And there will be no one to stop it. And whatever they want to do, they're going to do. Yeah. So you have the underpinnings of it right here. It was going that way right after the flood. They were headed right back to it. And God said no, and he created the languages and he scattered them. Because that's what he wanted. That's his design for not allowing evil to completely spread across the earth. Nations can stand up against each other and stop great evil from spreading. That's kind of the pattern, right? So that's the nations. That's the nations. And from that, we're going to move on to, that's the first half of Genesis. The creation, the fall, the flood, the nations. That's your progress of seeing how God establishes the beginnings of everything on the earth. You have, marriage and family and nations and everything established on the earth from the creation and the fall and the flood and the nations. So that's the beginnings. The second half of the book goes into the beginnings of one specific nation through Abraham. That is the nation of Israel. And so now you see how God began to establish the nation of Israel. And in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, that's your verses for your memory verses, because it really explains everything that happens in the book of Genesis from now until the end. Chapter 12 through chapter 50 is understood from the first 3 verses in chapter 12, right? So when Yahweh says to Abram, go forth from your land and from your kin and from your father's house, I'm learning it through the Legacy Standard, right? And to the land which I will show you, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And the one who blesses you, I will bless, and the one who curses you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed, right? So that promise, God speaks to Abraham here, and he establishes an outline for the rest of the book. He establishes a relationship with Abraham based on what he says in these first 3 verses. So we know from Galatians that verse 3, the importance of it is that in you all the families of the earth will be blessed, is a reference to that a descendant of Abraham will come, who is the Messiah, Jesus Christ. The New Testament points back to this verse as saying that was the fulfillment of this promise. How were all the families of the earth blessed in Abram? Because he's the bringer of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, in his descendants, right? Chapter 17, it'll talk about his seed. And in his seed, singular, that is the one descendant who is Jesus Christ, is the fulfillment of these promises. Now, this is where we have to talk for a minute about covenants. Covenants become pretty important in the understanding of God's relationships with mankind. Relationships are really explained in terms of a covenant. A covenant is an agreement between 2 people. Simple understanding. It's just a contract or an agreement between 2 people. Ancient nations used to establish covenants. Families established covenants. Businesses established covenants. Their contracts is another way you can understand them. They had formal agreements that would lay out the responsibilities of both sides in a covenant, right? Or a contract or an agreement. God says, here's my agreement. If you just go out, right, follow in obedience here, you just have to listen about leaving your land and going to your other land. I'm going to begin and initiate all of these things for you, right? And so he says, all you got to do is leave the Ur of the Chaldees, go to the land which I'll show you, which you have no idea where you're headed until I tell you, and you don't know where it's at and how you're going to get it or any of that. Just believe me, walk in obedience, and I will do all these things. I will make you a great nation. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great. I was talking with Ann just a minute ago. If you go back to chapter 11, the whole purpose of the one world government was they said, we want to make a great name for ourselves on the earth. We want to establish our reputation, our greatness. God says, I'm going to scatter that one, and I'm going to establish Abraham with a great name. He's going to have the great name in all the earth. It's going to be through him. And so you have a connection between the nations. They're not going to establish a great name for themselves. Not God is going to be the one to do it, and God's going to do it through Abraham. He'll get the great name. And so you can look at that and see the connection there, chapter 12 and chapter 11. So you have this pattern. Of course, Abraham is going to leave. He'll change his name to Abraham later, but Abraham leaves. He takes Lot with him, Sarai. And you have the pattern of his going out, and you have the little difficulty in Egypt with saying that Sarai was his sister, which was true, but it was only half true, and so he gets a little slap on the wrist for that one, and Pharaoh has to deal with it. But through all of that, God is still protecting Abram, and the real viewpoint there is that God is not going to let things happen that should not happen, and God is going to keep things on the straight and narrow with Abram and Sarah, and he's looking out. God is preserving. See, Abraham could have gotten in trouble. Abraham could have, potentially, right? If Sarah is not in the picture, that's not the way God is planning it, right? So God says, no. We're going to keep that one secure. Sarah is your wife. Sarah is the one through whom I'm going to initiate this promise. So these little problems where he fibs about, or tries to hide, they might kill me because you're so beautiful thing. Okay, that's a great way to get on our good side. But the thing is, God says, but we're not going to let that get you into trouble, okay? That could have caused, potentially you're going, well, if it's supposed to be through Sarah and she goes off with Pharaoh, that wrecks the plan. God says, I'm not letting it happen, right? I think the simplicity of it is just God says, no, you can be stupid. I'm going to keep this thing on the right track. right? There are weaknesses in mankind and weaknesses in our walk, and God says, I've got ways to keep you faithful. I can look back and think of 100 ways in which I was exceedingly more stupid than I ever should have been, and God didn't let me get into trouble over it when I really should have. Okay? I was an adventure-seeking, kind of thrill-seeking guy, and, I could be dead. So God did not let me die. And but that's just how God operates. And through Abraham, what you see is a picture and an outline of faithfulness on God's side. It's really just to say, Abraham, you were diverting yourself here. We're going to get you back on track. God has a plan. God's not going to let it go off the rails. Okay? If you look back in your life and you see how God has kept you and faithful in spite of yourself, this is an Abraham example of it. Right? He could have been a little derailed and said, that's not how it's going to work. Now, you get to chapter 15, and there's kind of the importance. If you have questions, you got to stop me along the way, because I want to kind of get to some important things here. So, chapter 14, quickly, Melchizedek. You got to understand Melchizedek. So, if you're wondering about Melchizedek, he is a true priest of God. He is just not a part of the economy of the law. He exists and he operates as a priest for God outside of the law economy. Hebrews kind of makes that clear. He was a priest Jesus was a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, meaning that the priesthood of Jesus did not have to work according to the same Aaronic priesthood of the law economy. It existed outside of that. And so you don't have to have the same lineage as the Aaronic priesthood and so forth. We can talk about it if you have more, if you bring questions up about it, but that's just kind of the point. Melchizedek existed in the location of Jerusalem. He was the priest in Salem. After this battle where Abraham rescues Lot, there was a battle between the kings of the valley and the kings, to the west, and so you have these kings who fight a battle. Abraham rescues Lot. He rescues all of the goods, and he gets a whole bunch of, booty, spoils of war out of all this. He comes and he offers a tenth to Melchizedek. It's simply recognition of God's working. He would not have won this battle had it not been for God. He's fighting 9 armies, I think. 9 armies are fighting together, and he comes in with 300 guys and whoops their butt. God did this. He offers his tithe to that in recognition of God's victory in preserving him. The point is, the other king says, dude, you should take everything. Abraham says, no way. Why? So he simply says, I don't want anybody to say that it was anybody but God who delivered me. If I take your portion of this, it looks like you made me rich. It looks like you benefited me. I only want God to benefit me. So Abraham is recognizing that fact that God preserved me through this victory. I only want the portion that God gives me. I don't want to take yours too, even though you're offering it up. That way nobody says Abraham was made rich through other men.
I always wondered if this could have been Jesus Christ, or a foreshadowing of him.
I think a foreshadowing of him, yes, because I think Hebrews makes that clear. I believe he's a different person, but a real person, but a real priest of God. So in some way, he understood obedience to God. He understood the requirements of obedience to God, right? We're not talking about the following the law, but he had sacrifice. He understood sacrifice for sins. He understood substitution. He understood being a righteous priest for God. And Abraham recognizes him as a priest for God. Mm-hmm. So he's genuine. He's the real deal. It's hard to say a lot about Melchizedek because you just don't know a lot. But he's absolutely a foreshadow of a type of Christ, right? And Christ's priesthood is predicated on understanding Melchizedek being not a part of the Mosaic law economy, right? Being outside of that. Hebrews talks more about that. You can go into Hebrews and kind of look at that. But chapter 15 is another chapter that's important. And you kind of look at chapter 12 and chapter 15 and chapter 17 as being critical to understanding God establishing his covenant with Abraham. God establishing a covenant with Abraham that is critical. It's an eternal covenant. It's a never-ending covenant. And as you get to chapter 17, it's a one-sided covenant. We talk about the fact that covenants lay out responsibilities for both people, and as God expands the understanding of this covenant by chapter 17, and we'll get there, he says, no, I myself am going to fulfill this covenant for you, and you don't have any part in fulfilling it. Okay? So it becomes a unique covenant, different than the Mosaic economy or covenant. The Mosaic Old Testament law economy is different. It had a limited duration. It had a responsibility aspect to it that kind of babysits the promises of Abraham until Christ would come. But they're not the same. The Abrahamic promise or covenant here, God eventually says, I'm doing it all by myself, and Moses will come in and babysit it until Jesus comes. I'm keeping it kind of simple. So we ever want to get into covenants, and we get into Galatians and look at them and, take it apart. But just so you understand, so when you get to chapter 15, I look at verse 1 as a response to his encounter with the victory in this battle and the not taking recognition from it from the other kings, or their portions of it from the other kings. He's honoring God in all of that. He's tithing God in all of that. And in chapter 15, God comes back and says, good job, buddy. That's exactly the way you need to be. Do not fear, Abraham. I'm going to be your shield. Your reward is going to be very great. God says, for honoring all of that you just did, I will reward you. For being honorable and obedient in chapter 14 and all that he did, not taking the extra, God says, I'll be the one to do it. So God responds to that faithfulness in chapter 14, and he begins to clarify. And that's what he says in chapter 15, verse 1. After these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a victory, saying, do not fear, I'm a shield to you, your reward shall be very great. And in verse 2, Abram said, O Lord Yahweh, what will you give me as I go on being childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. He's going, yeah, sounds great. Love the idea of the promise of reward, but remember, this whole thing works through descendants. This whole thing works through having children. Abraham understood that. He's going, how is it supposed to work now, God, again? Is it going to be through Eliezer? He's kind of an adopted child, right? I kind of adopted him so that I had somebody to pass my stuff on to. Is this how it's going to be? Doesn't make Eliezer a good or bad person. None of that. This is just saying Abraham had a plan and a design that because I have no children, I've named him my descendant. I want to be able to pass it on when I die. And since I have no children, I've kind of adopted Eliezer. God doesn't say anything bad about Eliezer. He just says that's not the one. It's not going to be the one. Right? So the first option is Eliezer. Right? God says, no, this man will not be your heir, but the one shall come from your own body will be your heir. So now it's not through adoption. We're not doing this through adoption. That's not how it's going to work. So the simplicity in chapter 4 is that he says, it's going to come forth from your own body, your own seed, your own descendant, natural descendant, right? So now we have Abraham's side of it. Abraham, it has to come from Abraham's seed. Look toward the heavens, count the stars. If you're able to count them, so shall be the number of your descendants. Abraham's getting older, but it says he believed God and it counted to him as righteousness. And if you look to Romans, you look to the New Testament, this is the basis of God's salvation for Abraham. He believed God through faith. Right? He couldn't understand how this was all going to work out. I don't know. Dude, I'm an old guy. I've not had any kids. You say it's going to work that way? I believe you. Right? God makes a promise. I believe it without knowing how it's going to work out. That's faith. It works the same for us. We don't know how God's going to work in our life. Yes, I believe you, God. So, chapter 15, he establishes and expands the covenant that it has to be through Abraham. And so, he establishes that, and if you go to the bottom of the screen there, verse 17, he just says, it came about that when the sun had set, it was very dark. He begins to say, how are these things going to happen in chapter 15, right? He says, get the animals, lay them out, right? As he says, we're going to establish this is a formal way of recognizing a covenant or a contract. And so in chapter 15, I didn't put it up on the screen, but it says, he says, let me get there. Oh, yeah. Verse 9, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon dove. Don't ask me why these specific animals. But it's understood historically that they would use animals and they would cut them in half in order to establish a contract or a covenant. And this is how it would work, okay? When they did this historically, they would cut the animals in half, which is killing them. They would walk between the animals, the two people who were agreeing to this covenant, and usually it was a covenant of protection or agreement or mutual benefit, and they would say, if we break this covenant, so will the person who breaks the covenant be like these animals if we break it. Dead. Right? This is the style of covenant they would make. And so two people would make that kind of a covenant. You know, we know that Abraham makes a covenant with Abimelech and other people of mutual benefit, right? And you have different agreements made in Genesis like that. Isaac reestablishes that covenant with Abimelech and says, we're going to continue that covenant with my father of mutual benefit who's a Philistine king, right? And so you have those things that take place in Genesis. Here, the big deal in chapter 15, and you look at verse 17, is that God appears, the sun was very dark, then there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between the pieces. And on that day Yahweh cut a covenant with Abraham, to your seed I have given this land, right? So the figurative picture here is that Abraham never walks between these two pieces. He has no part of responsibility in this covenant. God says, because two pieces of God, in a sense, two pictures of God walk between the pieces, God says, I myself am going to fulfill this covenant. It's all on me, buddy. I want you to know how certain this is going to happen. I'm going to make certain. It's not about your side of responsibility. It's about me, a faithful God, and a powerful God, doing everything. And so God in two figures and pieces, the smoking oven, when it says there the flaming torch and the smoking oven, that's God going through twice saying it's all on me. You don't have to walk through this one, Abraham. It's not on you. It's about giving you life. It's about bringing fulfillment to this promise. And so there is no threat of condemnation. There is no threat of death to Abraham on this.
So he's, quote, asleep. Is this happening in a vision to him then?
Kind of, yeah. It says it's in a vision, so yeah. I don't know what, like 50-50? I don't know. But yeah.
I mean, it's like, because he wants to make Abraham certain he knows this. But
correct. Yeah.
It seems kind of strange that he's asleep, but, I guess he can speak in visions pretty
I think he woke him up. It says great fear came upon him. I think he got the adrenaline rush on that one. So, yeah. When he saw what was going on. So, but yeah, it does. And the vision, again, the sleep, I think, just puts him into the point, like you said, this is just for you, Abraham. This is just for you to know and understand. So, but he does. And so the covenant aspect in chapter 15, it goes like that. It says God is the one to fulfill it. Abraham does not have a requirement on the other side of this one. God and God himself on this one. It's an eternal covenant. And so he describes the outline of the land in chapter 15, right? That's part of what they call the Palestinian portions of the covenant, right? Very clearly defined geography about the land of Israel that Abraham was given. When you get to chapter 17, you get another amplification or explanation of the covenant or promise that God makes with Abraham. And so I'm really focusing on that. And so it begins with kind of a name change, right? He's 99 years old. And God begins to establish in chapter 17, verse 1, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, so that I may confirm my covenant between me and you, and that I may multiply you exceedingly. And Abraham fell on his face, and God spoke further in verse 4, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. And no longer, verse 5, the covenant here is established with this name change. God renames them. You shall be called not Abram, but Abraham, father of many. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and make nations and kings come forth from you. Right? I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed after you. And there it is. That's the reference in Galatians when it goes back and says, what does he mean by seed? Singular. That is one descendant. That is Jesus Christ. And so the importance of chapter 17 he amplifies and said it's coming out through the generations in the future through a single seed, a single descendant, that this will all be fulfilled. And so God is explaining more about the covenant. And throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, right? Well, the nation of Israel is no longer. The nation of Israel goes away and is replaced by the church. No, this is an everlasting covenant that's designed for God and the descendants of Abraham. And there are portions of it that do not get superseded, right? God is faithful to fulfill everything that he promises the descendants of Abraham. And it says, I will give to you and to your seed after you the land you're sojourning on, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession. So the part of it, the land being the descendants of Abraham, the nation of Israel, that's everlasting. It never ends. Now, he goes and he says the same thing in verse 15 to Sarah. So, Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah, I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. So before it was like, no, Abraham, not through adoption, but through your seed. Now it's not through any other descendant. It's going to be Sarah. I skip over Hagar. You can read it if you've read that through. Hagar was an attempt at creating a pathway for the covenant fulfillment that God said no to. God rejects that. He says, that's by your own hand, Abraham. I'm not doing it that way. Nothing wrong with Hagar. There's blessings attached for her and her attempt and her connection to all this. There's some, the family tree, if you read through Genesis, it stays all three descendants through the second wife, Keturah, through Hagar, through Isaac, right? All three have descendants that become people groups all throughout around the nation of Israel and in the Middle East there. And so you have, through those three descendants of Abraham, three family trees. Almost everybody in the Middle East ends up being from them. So you can look at that in a little more detail. But he says not through Hagar, through Sarah. God makes it very clear. You read Romans chapter 9. It was always, God said, it's only because I want it through my choice, Abraham. You've tried twice to have it your way. Now I'm going to take the impossible way. And we're going to do it in a way that can't be done. Sarah, way past childbearing years. You, way past you old and, ancient, says it's never supposed to work that way. It's going to happen that way. That's the way it's going to happen. God chooses the impossible route. You've had two possible routes. We're not doing it that way. We're going to do it this way. So really it's just so that Romans 9 says so that God's choice would stand. Not the way Abraham wanted it. I mean, he would have wanted it, but he tried twice to do it his own way, and God said no to each one. That's kind of the simple explanation of what Hagar is in the picture. So, nothing good or bad about it. It's just that so that God's choice would stand. Right? Was it a legitimate marriage? Was it a legitimate family tree in the way of the earth? It was. Right? I mean, polygamous marriage was a thing at the time. God kind of reduces that by the time Moses comes around, but it was normal at this time, and the earth was being populated at this time, and multiple marriages and contracts like this were normal. Doesn't mean it was the right way, just it was normal. So you get there in chapter 17 that Sarah is the avenue of promise. Sarah and her seed with Abraham, right, together, that's the avenue of promise. That's where you get to when you get to chapter 18. Interesting in chapter 18, right? And I like the LSB, just the Legacy Standard, because they put the name of Yahweh back in. Whenever you see the capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D in the other translations, it's a replacement for what's in the original Hebrew, which is the name of God, which is Yahweh, which is actually in the text. It's left over from a Hebrew superstition about not saying the name of God out loud, that in the Hebrew people never change the actual text of the Hebrew Bible. It always says Yahweh. Whenever they see it in the text, they say Adonai. They say Adonai out loud. They won't say Yahweh out loud because it's a superstitious version of we're afraid of saying it wrong and God would get mad at us kind of a thing, right? A little bit of a superstition. And so that carried on into the way people translated the English Bible. They're like, we're just going to follow the Hebrew tradition and we're going to put Adonai in place of it. And so they always do it with a capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. Whenever you see that, it's actually the word Yahweh. And so the Legacy Standard, I've been using it for the Old Testament study. It's fairly new. It goes back and it says we're not following that tradition any longer. We're just going to go back to the actual Hebrew text and put the name of Yahweh back in everywhere that it is. So they don't follow the tradition of replacing it with Adonai, which was never in the written, ever in the written in Hebrew. They never changed the written word, ever. Always Yahweh. And so now the English, but this is one of the few English Bibles that go back and say we're just going to translate it exactly the way it was written. And that's the name Yahweh. So anyway, all of that to say, I think you get a little bit different flavor when you read, and you see like in chapter 18, verse 1, where it says there, then Yahweh appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, which he was sitting at the tent of the floor. They make the whole official visit with food and everything, because that's how you invite guests in. In chapter 18, 3 men come, but Yahweh with 2 other people. See, you don't always get that flavor from the other translations, but if you read it from the original, Yahweh comes with 2 other people to visit Abraham. Abraham receives him in. Yahweh is having a conversation with Abraham about some stuff, and he's got a couple of his buddies with him, 2 angels, who we find out pay a visit to Sodom. Okay? So Yahweh is conversing with Abram. He's saying, hey, verse 10, I want you to know, I'm going to come back this time, same time next year, and guess what? Your wife's going to have a baby. So just want to let you know, I haven't forgotten about that promise I made to you, Abraham. So it's going to happen. In verse 11, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age, and Sarah was past childbearing, and Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And verse 13, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I indeed bear a son when I am old? Is anything too difficult for Yahweh? Myself? At the appointed time I will return to you, and at this time next year Sarah will have a son. So Yahweh comes to tell him about it. Yahweh comes a year from now and says, hey, how's that baby thing going? Okay? Yahweh himself comes down and says, this is exactly the way I wanted it. Just paid a visit. Right? So you have a visit from Yahweh coming down and visiting with Abraham to explain that nothing is impossible with God. And so it's not an angel that delivers the message, it's not somebody else, but Yahweh himself. And so pretty significant in chapter 18. Then he gets into the discussion. Yahweh pulls him aside and says, my 2 buddies got to go. They're going to go visit Sodom, and I want to let you know what it's all about. Right? So you have in chapter 18, the men rose up, looked down, verse 16, towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking to send them all off. In verse 17, Yahweh said, should I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? I really don't have to tell you, but I'm kind of setting it up so that I will tell you, right? Because there's an object lesson in all of this. And so he says, since Abraham will surely become a mighty nation, a great and mighty nation, and to him all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed, should I let you know what I'm doing out there on the earth? I'm about to judge a nation called Sodom, because their wickedness is very great. And so he does. And he sets up, and he gives this honor to Abraham. And again, part of the blessing is that, hey, I'm going to let you know how God operates on the earth. And he tells them in verse 20, Yahweh said, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly great. And so he's going to judge them accordingly, whatever I find there, right? So whatever he finds is what's going to take place. And so in verse 21, I will go down and see whether they have done entirely according to its outcry, which has come to me, and if not, I will know. Then they have this whole discussion, right? Are there 50 righteous people? Are there 10 righteous people? Are there even 5 righteous people? Probably not, right? God says, yeah, if there's not, I'm going to judge them. So they get judged, meaning there's not 5 righteous people in the land. Lot seems to be the only one whom Hebrews says was a righteous man according to the Lord. So Lot and his family are living in the Las Vegas of the day. They're in Sin City. There's not 5 righteous people in the city. The 2 angels who are with Yahweh walk out, take a visit to Sodom, and they have their little adventure there, to which they deliver Lot and judge Sodom and Gomorrah by raining down fire and brimstone from heaven, wiping them off the face of the earth. We just continue with Abraham, and I want to at least get through Abraham today. Chapter 21, Yahweh took note of Sarah, right? And Yahweh did for Sarah what he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son, and that all of that takes place, right? God had appointed him exactly the time, and the way in which God had told him. So God fulfills his promise to Abraham in chapter 21. And so you have that promise fulfilled in chapter 22. You have the testing of Abraham. God says, take Isaac, take him up, offer him up as a sacrifice. Abraham acts in obedience with the understanding that he said, and he explains to God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. I'm not worried. I know God will provide, right? So the object lesson even for Isaac is that this is the way it's going to happen. I'm going to obey God even to this. I don't understand what's going to happen, but I know God will be faithful. And he does, and God withholds. And he blesses Abraham for his obedience in chapter 22. Chapter 23, Sarah dies. You get the death of Sarah, all that. Sorry. I want to get back, chapter 22. I don't want to skip it. So, and all of that, here is the other important part. I've kind of explained it to you from chapter 17, but here's a statement in chapter 22, verse 15 about Abraham's obedience to this. And this is what he says in verse 15 and 16. The angel of Yahweh called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares Yahweh. So there's the flavor and nature of this enduring covenant that he keeps explaining to Abraham over and over again, and adding kind of the details to it, right, throughout his life. You get to this point, and this is the flavor of it. It's a covenant that is by myself, right? He says there in verse 16, by myself I have sworn, declares Yahweh, because you have done this thing and have not spared your son, I will indeed greatly bless you, multiply your seed. And I think the by myself is referring back to 17 when he walked through the covenant and ratified it in that way. It's referring back to that picture when he says by myself. And so you have that picture of the covenant and being ratified in 22 and explained further that it's a covenant that God creates, God does all by himself. That's the flavor of the Abrahamic covenant versus like the law covenant. So, you have Isaac gets a wife from Abraham's relatives, his brother Nahor, and Rebecca, and so he's married in chapter 24. That kind of takes place, chapter 20, and then chapter 25, Abraham gives all that he had to Isaac. But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living and sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the east. Now, again, we know that through Ishmael, you have groups and people groups that kind of spread out through the land. Through Esau, there are people groups that spread out through the land. Through Keturah, Abraham's second wife, you get people groups that spread out through the land, like the Midianites, who you'll meet, in Exodus with Jethro, when Moses goes out that's a relative. It's a relative of his. Jethro is. Jethro comes from the Midianites, who comes from Midian, who comes from Keturah, Abraham's second wife. Yeah, so sometimes you gotta have family trees to figure all this out. So you'll meet Edomites, Amalekites. All these groups are people groups that come from Abraham. They are descendants of either Ishmael or Keturah, and the descendants of his second wife. Let's call it Hagar or Keturah if we go back to the wives, right? So they have descendants through Hagar and through Keturah, who become all the other people groups in the land that they're going to interact with later, that we'll try to call them out as we get to them, like Jethro will be the Midianites. They come through Abraham's second wife. So
when he's told that the descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars, they're included. It's not just...
And kings will come forth from you, like the king of the Midianites and the king of the Amalekites and the king of the whoeverite. I can't name them all off by the top of my head, but yeah.
The collective descendants, not just
correct.
Isaac.
Just the descendant of the promise is the one. But there are blessings to all, the blessings are attached to all the other groups because they become numerous and prosper and are blessed, and God kind of does that, right? Esau's a little different. Edomites don't have a great track record there, but the other ones, you'll see them as they come along, yeah. So that's kind of the history of Abraham, right? And the establishing of the promises of chapter 12, chapter 15, 17, 22. You get through all the amplifications of that original promise in chapter 12, and you get a pretty full understanding by the time you're done how God is going to operate this promise, covenant. And so Abraham dies. He gives everything that he had to Isaac, but there were gifts, right? Kind of like, here's your gifts, everything else goes to Isaac. Isaac is the one in promise. So he follows in obedience to God. They're not uncared for. They're cared for. But the avenue of blessing and promise and the greatest portion goes to Isaac. So we'll get to Isaac and Joseph next week. We'll have 3 weeks in Genesis. I think I'm doing pretty good moving through this. So I was trying for 2, but I knew that was impossible when I started. But thank you, Lord, for this time. And thank you for just the richness of understanding your faithfulness. Really a picture of you interacting with men, interceding on behalf of men, and promising your great promises by which we're all blessed. We thank you for your faithfulness, Lord, and the establishing of this promise through Jesus Christ. Amen.